Keith Urban is on stage for his first show since Nicole Kidman filed for divorce.
Nicole Kidman was part of a relationship that looked almost too precise to fail, a globally respected actress known for control, discipline, and emotional precision paired with a musician whose entire identity was built on expression, instability, and raw emotional exposure. But when you examine the structure of their relationship more closely, something doesn't fully add up. What most people didn't notice is that their connection wasn't built on shared stability, it was built on opposing needs that temporarily fit together. And when you trace those needs back to their origin, it begins to explain why what looked like balance was actually tension, quietly forming from the very beginning. From the outside, everything aligned in a way that made the relationship feel inevitable. Same generation, same cultural background, both rising to global prominence after overcoming personal hardship, it created a narrative that felt complete. But here's where it changes, because alignment in story is not the same as alignment in psychology. And that difference is where long-term relationships either stabilize, or slowly begin to fracture without anyone noticing at first. Nicole's early life shaped a pattern that most people overlooked because it appeared as strength. She was raised in an environment that valued structure, education, and discipline, and this is where it gets important, because when someone grows up in that kind of system, they don't just develop ambition, they develop a need for control as a way to manage internal sensitivity. Her shyness wasn't just a personality trait, it was an indicator of heightened emotional awareness without a direct outlet, and what most people missed is that performance became her way of regulating that. Acting wasn't just a career choice, it was a controlled environment where she could express intensity without losing stability, and that pattern of controlled expression would later define how she approached relationships. Her marriage to Tom Cruise introduced a completely different dynamic, and this is where the first major internal shift occurred because from the outside it looked like elevation into power and status, but internally it created imbalance through control, external influence, and eventually emotional displacement. But that's not even the main issue, because the defining moment wasn't the relationship itself, it was how it ended. Losing proximity to her children didn't just cause emotional pain, it reshaped her entire framework of attachment, and from that point forward stability was no longer something she preferred, it became something she required at all costs. When she re-emerged after that phase of her life, what most people saw was career dominance and resilience, but what they didn't see was the internal restructuring that had taken place because she was no longer operating from exploration, she was operating from protection. Every decision, every relationship, every environment had to meet a certain level of emotional safety, and that creates a very specific kind of pressure in any future partnership because it means the relationship is not just about connection, it's about maintaining stability at all times. Now shift to Keith Urban, because this is where the contrast becomes critical and where the hidden imbalance begins to form. His early life didn't revolve around structure, it revolved around unpredictability, movement, and emotional inconsistency, and this is where it gets important, because when stability is not consistently present during development, individuals don't learn control as a primary tool, they learn escape. Music became that escape for him, not just as a passion but as a way to process intensity externally rather than internally, and while that creates artistic depth, it also creates vulnerability because external regulation depends on circumstances staying favorable. By the time he reached success in Nashville, the pattern was already deeply embedded because what most people didn't notice is that success didn't stabilize him, it amplified him. The same tendencies that drove his creativity also drove his instability, and fame only increased access to both, which meant that his life operated in cycles of intensity rather than consistency. And this is where the deeper dynamic begins to take shape because when someone like that meets someone like Nicole, it doesn't just create attraction, it creates a system. She represented control, grounding, and emotional containment. He represented expression, release, and emotional expansion. And this is where it gets interesting, because on the surface, that looks like balance, but underneath it creates dependency because each person begins to rely on the other to compensate for what they themselves do not naturally provide. Their meeting in 2005 is often described as fate, but when you break it down, it was timing intersecting with need because both of them were at points in their lives where they were searching for something specific rather than something compatible. Nicole was looking for stability that felt emotionally safe but not controlling, and Keith was looking for stability that could anchor him without restricting him, and those two intentions sound similar, but they are not the same. The early phase of their relationship moved quickly, and this is where one of the most overlooked patterns appears because speed in relationships often creates the illusion of certainty. When emotional intensity is high, decisions feel obvious, but here's where it changes. Because intensity does not test compatibility, it bypasses it. Within a year, they were married, and from the outside it reinforced the idea that everything had aligned perfectly, but internally, the foundation had not been fully examined. Then came the defining moment that set the tone for everything that followed. Just months into the marriage, Keith entered rehab, and this is where the relationship stopped being about mutual growth and started becoming about role assignment. Nicole stepped into the stabilizer role immediately, not just because she cared, but because her psychological framework required her to maintain control over instability, and Keith stepped into the role of the one needing stabilization, not intentionally, but because his existing patterns made that position inevitable. And this is where the deeper issue locks in because once roles are established under pressure, they tend to persist even when circumstances improve. What most people didn't notice is that this moment didn't just challenge their relationship, it defined it. From that point forward, their connection was no longer operating as two individuals growing together, it was operating as a system where one regulates and the other is regulated. Publicly, this created a powerful narrative because people saw loyalty, resilience, and commitment, and those elements were real, but they were also incomplete because they only showed the surface layer. Behind that, there was a continuous process of maintenance that required effort, adjustment, and constant recalibration, and that kind of dynamic, while sustainable in the short term, creates long-term fatigue if the balance does not shift. As their careers expanded, the external pressures increased, and this is where another layer of tension begins to form because long-distance schedules, filming commitments, and touring cycles don't just create physical separation, they create psychological divergence. Each person begins adapting to their own environment independently, and over time, those adaptations create subtle differences in perspective, behavior, and expectation. Nicole moved further into structure, focusing on family, routine, and controlled environments for her children because for her, stability wasn't just a preference, it was protection. Keith, however, remained connected to a lifestyle that involved movement, unpredictability, and constant performance cycles, and while he valued family, his environment reinforced a different rhythm of living. And this is where it gets important, because relationships don't break from obvious conflict first, they shift through quiet misalignment. Different routines, different coping mechanisms, different emotional needs, all developing slowly without immediate confrontation. But here's the part most people missed, they maintained the image perfectly. Public appearances, interviews, red carpets, all reinforcing the same narrative of strength and connection, and the longer that image remained consistent, the more pressure it created internally because maintaining a perception requires energy, and that energy has to come from somewhere. Over time, Nicole's role as the stabilizer became heavier, not because Keith wasn't improving, but because the system itself required her to remain in that position. And Keith began to feel the weight of that dynamic, not as blame, but as limitation because being constantly perceived as the one who needs support can create resistance, even when the support is genuine. And this is where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore because she needed consistency to feel secure, and he needed space to feel stable. Both needs are valid, but they rarely align naturally without adjustment, and when adjustment becomes constant, it turns into strain. As the years progressed, the tension didn't explode, it accumulated, and that accumulation is what makes these situations so difficult to recognize from the outside because there's no single event to point to, no clear moment where everything changes. Instead, there is a gradual shift in energy, in interaction, in emotional availability. By the time they entered the later phase of their marriage, the relationship had become something different from what it started as, not worse in an obvious sense, but heavier, more complex, more dependent on effort than on natural alignment. And that's not even the main issue, because the real turning point wasn't conflict, it was realization. Nicole began to recognize that maintaining the system required more from her than it was giving back, not emotionally in a dramatic sense, but structurally in a consistent one. And Keith began to recognize that the version of himself required to sustain the relationship didn't fully align with how he functioned naturally, even when he tried. And when both individuals reach that point at the same time, the outcome doesn't come from anger, it comes from clarity. As the marriage moved beyond its early years, what began as a system of mutual support slowly transitioned into a system of sustained effort, and this is where the shift becomes almost invisible to outsiders because nothing appears broken on the surface. They were still attending events together, still speaking highly of each other in interviews, still reinforcing the same narrative that had defined them for years, but here's where it changes. Because consistency in appearance does not mean consistency in experience, and what most people didn't notice is that their relationship had entered a phase where maintenance required more energy than connection naturally provided. By the mid-2010s, subtle patterns began to repeat more frequently, and repetition is where deeper fractures begin to form because when the same issues resurface without full resolution, they don't just remain problems, they become cycles. Nicole's need for structure started to intensify, not in a controlling way that was visible, but in a protective way that shaped how decisions were made, how time was managed, and how family life was organized. And this is where it gets important, because when one partner begins structuring the environment more tightly, it often signals an underlying lack of trust in stability itself, even if that lack of trust is never directly expressed. Keith, on the other hand, was operating within a completely different internal rhythm, one that didn't respond well to increasing structure over time because his sense of balance depended on fluidity, movement, and creative freedom, and while he valued what Nicole brought into his life, the same stability that grounded him also began to feel restrictive in subtle ways that are difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore over long periods. And this is where the contradiction becomes more pronounced because both individuals were still trying to meet each other's needs, but the way they were doing it started to create friction instead of harmony. Nicole was giving more structure to create safety, while Keith was seeking more flexibility to maintain his sense of identity, and what most people missed is that these adjustments were happening simultaneously, pulling the relationship in two different directions without either person intending to create distance. As their daughters grew, another layer of complexity was added, and this is where the dynamic deepens because parenting doesn't just introduce responsibility, it amplifies existing differences. Nicole leaned heavily into routine, consistency, and emotional protection, driven by her past experiences and her determination not to repeat the kind of loss she had previously endured, and this approach created a stable and secure environment for their children, but it also reinforced her role as the primary architect of the family system. Keith approached parenting from a different angle, one that emphasized connection, spontaneity, and emotional openness, and while this made him deeply loved by his children, it also created moments of imbalance where expectations around discipline, structure, and consistency didn't always align with Nicole's approach, and these differences didn't explode into major conflicts, but they accumulated as quiet disagreements that slowly shaped how each of them experienced the partnership. And this is where it gets important. Because relationships don't deteriorate through dramatic failures alone, they shift through repeated minor misalignments that gradually erode the sense of being understood. Each small disagreement, each moment of difference, each instance where one partner feels slightly out of sync with the other adds to a larger pattern that becomes harder to ignore over time. Publicly, however, none of this was visible, and this is where the psychological pressure begins to intensify because maintaining an image of stability while experiencing internal strain creates a dual reality. On one side, there is the version of the relationship that is presented to the world, polished, consistent, and reassuring. On the other side, there is the private experience, where effort, adjustment, and unresolved tension continue to build. What most people didn't notice is how much energy it takes to sustain that duality, because every public appearance, every interview, every statement reinforcing their strength required alignment in messaging, even when alignment in experience was becoming more difficult to maintain, and over time, that gap between appearance and reality begins to create internal exhaustion. Nicole, who had built her life around maintaining control and stability, began to feel the weight of constantly holding that structure together, not in a dramatic or visible way, but in a persistent and underlying sense that she was responsible for keeping everything balanced, and that responsibility, while rooted in care, gradually turned into pressure because it left little room for her to step out of that role. Keith, meanwhile, began to feel the impact of being consistently positioned within that system, not necessarily as someone being controlled, but as someone being managed in ways that conflicted with his need for autonomy, and this is where it gets complicated, because even when someone understands why a system exists, it doesn't mean they can comfortably function within it indefinitely. As the years progressed into the early 2020s, the signs of divergence became more noticeable, not through major public incidents, but through patterns that began to shift subtly. They were seen together less frequently, their schedules appeared more independent, and their public interactions, while still warm, began to carry a sense of familiarity rather than spontaneity, and this is where it gets important, because when relationships transition from natural connection to performed connection, the difference is often subtle but significant. Their interviews continued to emphasize strength, commitment, and resilience, but the language itself began to change slightly, becoming more focused on effort rather than ease, more centered on work rather than flow, and what most people missed is that this shift in language often reflects a deeper shift in experience because when relationships require constant effort, it usually indicates that natural alignment has weakened. And this is where repetition fatigue begins to take hold because when the same adjustments are made repeatedly without fully resolving the underlying differences, the effort itself becomes draining. Nicole found herself continuously reinforcing stability, continuously ensuring that everything remained intact, while Keith found himself continuously adapting to expectations that didn't fully match how he operated naturally, and over time, both of these processes create fatigue in different ways. Nicole's fatigue came from carrying the responsibility of maintaining the system, while Keith's fatigue came from operating within a system that required constant adjustment, and this is where the imbalance deepens because both individuals are giving effort, but they are experiencing that effort differently, which makes it harder to recognize that the strain is mutual rather than one-sided. As external pressures continue to increase through career demands, media attention, and public expectation, the internal space available for addressing these issues became more limited, and this is where it gets critical, because without space to process and realign, differences don't resolve, they solidify. The turning point didn't arrive as a single event, and that's what makes this situation particularly complex because there was no obvious breaking moment, no scandal, no dramatic confrontation that marked the beginning of the end. Instead, there was a gradual realization that the system they had built was no longer sustainable in its current form. Nicole began to recognize that the role she had been playing for years was no longer something she could maintain without compromising her own sense of balance, and this realization didn't come from a sudden decision, it came from accumulated experience, from years of managing, adjusting, and holding the structure together, until the effort required exceeded what she could continue to give. Keith, on the other hand, began to recognize that the expectations embedded within the relationship no longer aligned with how he needed to function, not because he didn't value the relationship, but because the version of himself required to sustain it felt increasingly disconnected from his natural way of operating, and this is where it gets important, because when identity and relationship expectations begin to diverge, the tension becomes difficult to resolve without significant change. By the time they reached the final stage of their marriage, the shift was no longer something that could be adjusted through effort alone, and this is where the entire dynamic begins to reveal itself more clearly because what once functioned through compensation had now reached a point where compensation itself was no longer enough. Nicole had spent years maintaining a structure that ensured stability, continuity, and protection, and while that structure had held the relationship together for a long time, it had also locked her into a role that required constant output without equal replenishment, and this is where it gets important, because when one person becomes the system that holds everything together, the moment they begin to step back, even slightly, the entire structure starts to destabilize. Keith, on the other hand, had spent years operating within that structure, adapting where necessary, adjusting where possible, and expressing himself through channels that allowed him to process what he couldn't always articulate directly. But here's where it changes, because adaptation has limits, and when someone reaches the point where adaptation begins to conflict with identity, the tension becomes internal rather than external. What most people didn't notice is that by this stage, neither of them was trying to change the other anymore, which might seem like progress on the surface, but in reality, it often signals disengagement because when effort to adjust stops, it usually means acceptance has shifted into separation. The decision itself didn't arrive through a dramatic confrontation, and that's what made it so difficult for outsiders to fully understand because there was no defining incident to point to, no single moment that marked the collapse, and this is where the deeper pattern becomes clear because the end of long-term relationships is rarely explosive, it is cumulative. Years of repeated dynamics, unresolved differences, and structural imbalance eventually reach a point where continuation requires more compromise than either person is willing or able to give, and at that point, the decision becomes less about emotion and more about sustainability. When Nicole Kidman filed for divorce in 2025, the official reasoning was simple and familiar: irreconcilable differences, but here's where it gets important, because those two words often mask a far more complex reality. They don't describe a single issue, they describe a pattern that has repeated enough times to become permanent, and what most people missed is that the filing itself wasn't the beginning of the end, it was the formal acknowledgement of something that had already been happening for a long time. Her decision reflected a shift from preservation to self-protection, and this is where the psychological weight of the situation becomes evident because for years, she had prioritized maintaining the relationship, maintaining the family structure, and maintaining the image that had been built around them, but at some point, maintaining everything externally began to conflict with maintaining herself internally, and when that conflict becomes clear, the direction of the decision changes. Keith's response unfolded in a completely different way. And this is where the contrast between them becomes even more visible because while Nicole moved with control, restraint, and minimal public expression, Keith Urban moved through expression, symbolism, and visibility. His first performances after the separation weren't just concerts, they were signals, and this is where it gets important, because in situations like this, actions often communicate more than direct statements. Appearing without his wedding ring was not just a personal choice, it was a visible confirmation of transition, and when he began altering lyrics during live performances, the message became even more layered because lyrics are not just words in that context, they are emotional translations. Changing a line from something neutral into something more pointed introduced interpretation, and interpretation is what drives public perception, and this is where the narrative began to shift rapidly. What most people didn't notice is that these changes weren't just expressions of frustration, they were indicators of processing because when individuals who are used to externalizing emotion face internal disruption, they often use familiar channels to make sense of it, and for Keith, that channel was music. Removing certain songs from his setlist, particularly those associated with their relationship, wasn't just about performance choices, it was about redefining identity in real time. And this is where the dynamic becomes even more complex because while Nicole was attempting to minimize exposure and maintain privacy, Keith's approach increased visibility, and this contrast created a situation where the same event was being processed in two completely different ways publicly. One side was controlled, measured, and quiet, while the other was expressive, reactive, and open, and neither approach was inherently right or wrong, but together, they amplified the perception of division. The media quickly began constructing narratives, and this is where external interpretation starts to distort internal reality because public framing often simplifies complex situations into roles. Nicole was positioned as the composed figure who had reached her limit, while Keith was framed as the emotional figure navigating the aftermath, and while these narratives contained elements of truth, they also overlooked the deeper structure that had led to this point. At the center of everything was the question of family. And this is where Nicole's past played a critical role in shaping her decisions because her previous experience of losing proximity to her children had left a lasting imprint, one that influenced how she approached this separation. Seeking primary residential custody was not just a legal move, it was a continuation of her need to maintain stability and prevent repetition of past loss, and this is where the pattern comes full circle because her earlier experiences directly influenced her actions in this moment. Keith's acceptance of that arrangement reflected a different kind of reality, one shaped by his lifestyle and the nature of his work, and while it carried emotional weight, it also acknowledged the practical structure of their lives, and this is where it gets important, because sometimes decisions in these situations are not driven by preference, but by alignment with reality. In the weeks that followed, their paths diverged more visibly, but not dramatically, and this is where the final stage of the process becomes clear because separation at this level is not chaotic, it is controlled. Nicole focused on her children, her work, and maintaining a sense of continuity in her environment, reinforcing the same patterns of structure and stability that had defined her approach for years, while Keith immersed himself further into music, using performance as a way to process, express, and adapt to the shift. What most people didn't notice is that both of them were doing the same thing in different ways. They were returning to their default systems. Nicole returned to control and structure. Keith returned to expression and movement. And this is where the entire relationship can be understood more clearly because those default systems were always present, even at the beginning. The reason their relationship worked for as long as it did was not because those systems aligned, but because they compensated for each other temporarily, and once that compensation could no longer sustain the structure, the underlying differences became more visible. And this is where the deeper insight emerges because the end of their marriage wasn't caused by a lack of care, effort, or history, it was caused by the gradual realization that the system they had built required continuous adjustment without long-term resolution. They weren't failing each other in a traditional sense, they were operating within a structure that had reached its natural limit. From the outside, it looked like the collapse of a nearly perfect relationship, but internally, it was the conclusion of a long process that had been unfolding quietly for years, and this is where the most important pattern becomes visible because relationships built on compensation can appear stable for extended periods of time, but stability built on compensation requires ongoing effort, and effort without alignment eventually leads to exhaustion. What most people missed is that nothing about their relationship was fake. The connection was real, the effort was real, the commitment was real, but the structure was not sustainable indefinitely, and when sustainability becomes the central question, the outcome shifts from emotional to practical. And this is why the ending feels both sudden and inevitable at the same time, because while the public sees the final moment, the process leading to that moment has been developing beneath the surface for years, and once that process reaches its conclusion, the decision itself becomes clear, even if it is difficult. Their story, when viewed at the surface level, looks like a rise and fall, but when viewed through the deeper lens of patterns, behavior, and structure, it reveals something far more consistent because it follows a predictable trajectory. Two individuals with opposing systems come together, create balance through compensation, sustain that balance through effort, and eventually reach a point where the effort required exceeds the alignment available. And that's not just their story. That's a pattern that exists in many relationships that appear stable from the outside but operate under continuous internal adjustment. The difference is that most of those stories are never seen at this level of detail. Subscribe to the channel if you want to understand what's really happening behind situations like this.